It was a very live and real event, as well as an attack on what Jews around the world see as their place of safety, if you like. Part of what has led us to where we are is the Israeli government's position over now 15 or so years of conflict management rather than conflict resolution. When you don't resolve conflict, it builds up anger and despair that empowers terrorist organizations like Hamas.
Despite having drones and every kind of high-tech live streaming, the essence of human conflict has reemerged, which is that it is about striking fear and terror in your enemies.
The far right have this unfortunate identification with Israel as a bulwark against Islam and the developing world. Last year, the Israeli government invited us to a conference on combating antisemitism, and we had to decline because we realized they'd invited the far-right parties of Europe.
I'm Jason Pack, and this is a special October 7th anniversary commemorative episode of Disorder. Disorder is a podcast where we try to create a semblance of order in our mad world. Now, many on the anti-Zionist left in Britain and America would say the media harps too much on October 7th. They would say, of course, there were massacres on that horrific day, but enough of it. We've heard enough of it. We no longer need that to be mentioned, as to their mind, such commemorations are used as an implicit justification for the horrors and injustices and humanitarian catastrophes in Gaza. I think this narrative is false. I'd like to tackle it head on. We strive for balance here on Disorder. Last year, to commemorate October 7th, we hosted Sir Vincent Fien, the head of the Balfour Project, for a two-part episode. He said British interests and the interests of an ordered world lie in ceasing European support for Israel, pressuring Palestinian statehood, calling for a boycott on Israeli products, and making sure to end the settlement movement in the West Bank. Now, today we're going to have another approach. We're going to look at the legacy of that tragic day from the perspective of British Jewry, anti-Semitism, conspiracy theories, our culture wars, and why the position of Jews in the West is a critical matter for the state of an ordered global world. Then next week, on October 14th, we're going to include an on-the-ground Palestinian perspective, something we haven't done before on Disorder, as I will be joined from Ramallah by Sami Bahour, the chairman of Americans for a Vibrant Palestinian Economy. Now onward to today's show. To help us unravel this complex and multi-layered topic, I'm honored to be joined by Phil Rosenberg, the president of the Board of Deputies of British Jews. Phil is a former Labour councillor for West Hampstead and was previously the director of the Faiths Forum for London. Bruchim habayim b'disorder, Phil.
Thanks so much, Jason, and thanks for all your work in trying to order this very disordered world.
So, this show is airing on October 7th, 2025. You and I know that October 7th, 2023 is a day that's seared into all our memories and will live in infamy in how it reshaped the way the world looks and feels pretty much for all Jews globally, as much as Pearl Harbor or 9/11 did in their time for Americans. Can you explain this? Why did this day reshape things so much? Many mega orderers may not understand why October 7th has had such a large impact for diasporic Jews in Britain and America, even ones who don't have family in Israel.
Thanks so much, Jason. Well, I think you put it really well. We talk a lot these days in the Jewish community about being 8th of October Jews, that the world since then has changed beyond recognition for Jewish communities, not just here in the UK, but around the world, and of course also in Israel. Look, the way it shapes out is the following. The horrific attacks of that day, streamed live by some of the people committing the atrocities of that day, were really felt. They were terrible images for any person to see. But in the Jewish community, it felt very personal. We lost friends and family in that attack. We lost a family friend in that initial onslaught on the 7th of October, and a guy called Nathaniel Young. People were taken hostage. One of the people who works in our office had a cousin who was taken hostage, people who were killed in his family. So it was a very live and real event, as well as an attack on what Jews around the world see as their place of safety, if you like. After 2,000 years of persecution, the state of Israel represents not just a physical place and a spiritual homeland, but a place of psychic safety. This is the place where if they turn on us in this country or in another country, Jews can go to. And you saw that from parts of the Arab world. You saw it from the former Soviet Union. So you've had this horrific event. You've got an ongoing hostage crisis because 48 people are still hostage in Gaza. You've got the situation of an ongoing, very horrible war in which people are dying, Israelis and Palestinians, and then the kind of wider conflict that's spilled out into the sort of 7 countries, conflict battlefields Israel talks about that it's in. The devastating scenes we see in Gaza, which a lot of Jewish people are deeply concerned about. And then the massive rise in anti-Semitism that we've seen in our own societies. And it's important to reflect for a minute on this, because as you say, this has kind of broader implications. The first thing is this, that the biggest rise in anti-Semitism in this country came in the days following the 7th of October, 500% increase in the days following. Now, this tells you something very interesting, because oftentimes there's this idea that the rise of anti-Semitism is indelibly linked to Israel's actions. In fact, during those days, Israel was not strong. This was Israel's moment of greatest weakness. It hadn't really responded. It was still fighting back terrorists in the southern towns, trying to rescue hostages being held within Israel at that time. So there was something in some places and people which was excited by the sense not of Israel's strength, but of Israel's weakness. And suddenly the sense that they could turn on Jews without perhaps with impunity, the sense that consequences had gone. And so this has kind of shaped that. And of course, as the war has gone on, we've seen breakdowns in community cohesion, particularly in Muslim-Jewish relations, but more broadly. And that is really challenging. And particularly as we come, and we're speaking around second anniversary of October 7th, Israel's longest war, this has this kind of deep consequence now that we're still grappling with.
I think that's well put. And I would like to add perspectives from that day. I had an emergency podcast with David Patrikarakos in the wake of the horrific attack. I know that he's a mutual friend. And what we discussed was the psychic shock of, isn't Israel this technological superpower, inventor of lots of high-tech and AI things, some kind of regional military power? But yet people were able to go through the Gaza barrier envelope, go through the CCTV and camera detection things, and then regular people, not soldiers, I want to point this out, obviously you know this, I'm speaking to the audience, Phil, regular people in their homes and at music festivals who were unarmed were massacred and butchered. I want to make another point here, and I'm really interested to know how you feel on this 2 years in. I asserted at that moment that Hamas as a terror organization is able in a hand-to-hand, I look in the whites of your eye way, able to massacre Israelis because they are Jews. 9/11, more people were killed, but it's a bomb or it's a plane from the sky. I do not believe a Mexican cartel gang, if it infiltrates Texas from Mexico, can have hundreds of people going into the houses of, random Americans and slitting their throats, looking in the whites of their eyes. And that this is a fundamental difference, which is why we must go back to October 7th, because it has something to do with the role of hatred and anti-Semitism and filter bubbles and misinformation that we're going to get to. Do you agree with this assertion that if a gang of anti-American Mexican cartel members broke in to Texas, you could not see this hand-to-hand violence of this nature?
I'm not enough of an expert on Mexican cartels, but that would be my assumption. Hamas on that atrocious day attacked families. They killed children in cold blood. They tied families together and set them on fire. I mean, that cold-blooded way of attacking civilians, I think, was something particularly chilling. And it's kind of what informs a degree of Israel's population's fears, and to some extent this bleeds into the policy of, we just can't have that happen. We can't have a situation where an enemy will not just attack our soldiers or security enforcement people, that they will attack innocent people, as you say, at a music concert or in their homes in this atrocious way. And so something has to be done that permanently changes that situation. And the Israelis look at that situation of the atrocities by Hamas and say, yes, we've got to deal with Hamas. But beyond Hamas, also those people who armed and supported them, leading in the main back to Iran. But, Iran has this constellation of proxies. Hamas is one, Hezbollah is another, the Houthis are another. There are various militias, for example, in Iraq and other places, who all are trying to do things of this sort. Israel says that the reason it had to take the actions it took in Lebanon in a more constrained but a similar conflict, was because Hezbollah was effectively planning to do the same sorts of things. It had built the tunnels, it had the equipment, it was incredibly well armed and trained by Iran. And Israel had to take action to remove those threats from its borders.
I think you've done a good job of explaining how diasporic Jews, as well as, people who are plugged into this dimension, have felt very differently from October 8th, 2023 onward. And to my mind, this is because there's a way in which this conflict, despite having drones and every kind of high-tech live streaming, is more medieval and more primitive than, say, things that are going on in Iraq or Ukraine. All of a sudden, the essence of human conflict has reemerged, which is that it is about striking fear and terror in your enemies. And I think that this is important as we're going to pivot to ways in which anti-Semitism, as well as horrific violence against Jews, is a canary in a coal mine for other irrational hatreds and conspiracy theories. And we're going to come back to this. But I want to talk about you, Phil. So you run this organization, the Board of Deputies of British Jews. Not everyone will know what this is, what its meaning is. Tell us about how your life has changed since that day and how your job has changed. What do you do in terms of global geopolitics in this position?
The Board of Deputies of British Jews is the national representative body of the UK Jewish community to government, media, different faith communities, and diplomatic corps. So we speak across those different audiences. And it's an organization with a history. It was founded in 1760, so it's 16 years older than the United States. The United States now has a 47th president. I'm the 49th president of the Board of Deputies, just to give you a sense of the antiquity of the organization. And I was elected in May last year, so during this conflict. And obviously, so I knew that I was being elected into a situation where the UK Jewish community was in this sort of situation of this conflict in the Middle East that affected our friends and family, but also had these impacts on the streets here. I've got to be honest and say, I did not expect the war to be going on now. I expected we would have to deal with some of the war for a few months, maybe to the end of the summer. I came in June, maybe the end of the summer, or maybe, when Donald Trump came in and had managed to forge a ceasefire actually at that point. And I thought, that's it. So now I can focus on being the post-war president. And that's really what I wanted to do, building strong relations between different communities, tackling the issues, legacy issues of anti-Semitism, but broadly beginning to move things onto a better footing. Unfortunately, we're not there. The war is still going. It is in the, in mid-September, we've been looking at an escalation of the conflict in Gaza City, and it doesn't seem to be coming to an end anytime soon. So we kind of have to remain on a perpetual footing of this sort and try nonetheless to do those things that are important. Tackle anti-Semitism while the war is going on, continue to build up relations with different communities. I try to build the strongest possible bilateral ties between the UK and Israel at a time when they're deteriorating in both directions. So there's a lot to do, not necessarily the full positive agenda that I wanted, but I'm still trying to cling on to that positivity in the meantime, nonetheless.
You obviously have more positivity than I do. I woke up here in New Jersey, where I'm doing this interview, on October 8th, 2023. My then girlfriend reading the news on her phone and said, "Oh, there's another attack. It's one of these wars in the Middle East." And I read the news and I'm like, this is not just one of those wars in the Middle East. I had the sense that it would be a forever war and be permanent. And that's exactly the sense that I had on September 11th, 2001. My instant reaction, everything is different. And that's part of the reason I stopped doing biology and chemistry and started doing the Middle East. We will now have a forever war. I believe that this is a forever war, Phil. There's a whole range of reasons. I think neither Hamas nor Netanyahu want it to end. Zooming out more, how have you seen in your role the position of Jews in Britain changed by October 7th? And what would you like to see in terms of a more ordered world?
I think you see a whole range of things ongoing: concern, fear, trauma. We're not in post-trauma yet, but I think, at some point we may get there. I think you see a lot of divisions. Obviously, this is a very fierce, gruesome conflict, and you see different people coming forward with different ways to move beyond it. In terms of where we want it to go, I think we really want to see this horrible war end. And there are four main things that we would like to see. We'd like to see the hostages released. That's really, for us, absolutely crucial. These people contained in underground tunnels, we think, being starved. We've seen images of that. So we need the hostages out. We need to see aid into Gaza. We shouldn't see the Palestinian population suffering for the crimes of Hamas. We want to see Hamas prevented from having any further role in the governance of Gaza. It can't be that we have this terrorist organization there that says it will repeat the horrors of 7th October. They say that publicly. And we want to move from this war to a lasting peace and security for Israelis, Palestinians, and the wider Middle East. We want to see an end to that conflict. And, in the years before this, we saw the Abraham Accords, which began to see a kind of a different sort of narrative for the Middle East. We want to see that continue. We want to see a resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the best version of which is the two-state solution. We don't know of a better version. So we want to see us move towards that resolution because we can't keep in this space. And I think you're right to say that there are extremist groups who don't have an interest in that order. They want to be in this state of perpetual disorder, or at least this state of disorder until they have a complete winner takes all, which looks like some form of totally destroying the other. And that is just devastating. It's devastating for all concerned. And we really need to do everything we can to try and pull us into a different narrative and into a different place of peaceful coexistence, however hard and difficult that may sound. But that has to be the kind of landing point.
I was amazed in the wake of October 7th, 2023, the extent of penetration of misinformation and conspiracy theories about the October 7th. I was speaking to a former employee of mine in DC a few short days after, let's say, October 15th, 2023. And he told me, the Israelis, they have the best defenses on earth. They obviously let the Hamas and random Palestinian civilians get into Israel. So then there could be some outrages. So then they could reoccupy Gaza. This war is going to continue for 2 years. Now we've heard about the Hannibal Directive. We've heard every other thing. And as the war proceeds, this only justifies retroactively. Look, the conspiracy theories, they've occupied Gaza for these 2 years and all these babies have been killed. Clearly, this was a stitch up. How do you monitor those things, their impact on culture? What can we do to fight?
It's really concerning. And I think this goes quite deep, actually. In mid-September, I was at the annual dinner of a very good organization called the Holocaust Educational Trust. And Professor Deborah Lipstadt was speaking at this. Deborah Lipstadt was maybe known to some of your listeners as the person who took on David Irving in around the year 2000 in a trial around his Holocaust denial, and more recently was the special envoy at the State Department for Joe Biden on tackling anti-Semitism. And she said this really interesting thing, which was that she'd been looking at the challenge of Chinese particularly pushed anti-Semitic conspiracy theories on social media platforms, and she'd spoken to members of the US intelligence services and said, why are the Chinese doing this? We kind of understand that Iran has anti-Semitism as part of its worldview, the Iranian regime. But the Chinese, they have a lot of other things that they're interested in, but this doesn't seem to be something that would interest the Chinese Communist
And also
Party.
Important to point out that not only isn't there organic anti-Semitism in China, the Chinese harbored Jews in Shanghai during World War II. They've tended to have a largely positive interaction with Jews over the millennia, right? So that's why
Absolutely.
It's even more surprising.
It's more surprising. And to the extent that they have a minuscule Jewish population, mainly foreign expats in China, and relationships are pretty good there. So for all the things you might say about China, this is a sort of surprising projection of Chinese power. And apparently a response of American intelligence services is that China is using this as a proxy. There's attacks on the Jewish people and the intention to foment division by saying to the global South, America supports Israel. We support your brothers and sisters in Palestine. And that is kind of what they're trying to say. It seems Deborah Lipstadt didn't refer to this, but I think Russia has been doing similar things. Russia, again, doesn't have a huge skin in the game. Vladimir Putin has varied in his, many things you could say about Vladimir Putin, but has broadly, before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, was trying to project himself as a friend of the Jewish community globally in different kinds of ways, sometimes rather surreal ways, but it was nonetheless his policy. But the Russians use disinformation to try and pull parts of communities apart. So they'll land on any kind of debate, whether it's the Scottish independence referendum, Brexit, the transgender debate, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to try and foment discord and disorder in societies in the West so that they can destabilize them and weaken democratically elected governments. And so, with all these kind of adversaries of global order, anti-Semitism has this feature. And so, money investment is put inside fomenting those divisions, which is a matter of real concern.
For sure. You've cast that and explained that really well. I want to elaborate further and say that anti-Semitism differs from other forms of hatred in that it tends to postulate that Jews are part of a cabal which dominates global affairs and somehow benefits from the current structures of global order. So anti-Semitism is tied to the idea that there is a global order which is unjust. The Jew sits atop this global order. Maybe he is the puppet master because Trump and Xi and Keir Starmer are not themselves Jewish, but this global order is controlled by Jews. Ergo, we should just disorder it and break it up. And I want to toss this out to you that this is why anti-Semitism is a canary in the coal mine for all conspiracy theories. We've done a lot on conspiracy theories in this show, and we're going to put the link in the show notes to our episode about how even funny conspiracy theories about lizard men controlling the universe really get at certain core themes of order and disorder in politics. But anti-Semitism and comments about George Soros point out the injustice of the order is epitomized by Jews who have power, that somehow the machinations of everything are controlled by Jews. What can we do about this kind of ideation? And what does it say to you about where people are at about global coordination and the UN and comments about other things that they attach to the Jewish community in nonsensical and conspiratorial ways?
I think conspiracy theorists in general try and look at an other that they can try and blame everything on. And usually it's a group that maybe doesn't have the same ability to speak up for itself or whatever. So you've seen throughout history, Jews have been too rich. Sometimes they've been too poor. Sometimes they've been too like us. Sometimes they've been too unlike us. Sometimes they've been seen as too communist and sometimes as too capitalist. So depending on the kind of view of the extremists and the conspiracy theorists, Jews can be kind of squeezed into any kind of series of unpopular positions that they want to point at. And I think you're right to say that anti-Semitism is a canary in a coal mine. You see in societies where anti-Semitism has grown, Jews have been attacked, and in some cases Jews have either been massacred or driven out in other ways. It tends to break at the very cohesion of society. I was at an event a few years ago looking at the forced migration of Christians or the murder of Christians in Iraq. And a Christian leader from Iraq was speaking about the problems there. And when I asked a question reflecting on, the history of the Jews in Iraq, many of whom were driven out under Saddam Hussein, he said, that's exactly the sort of thing we're worried about. When Jews were forced out of Iraq, it destroyed a hugely important part of society, people who were active in our economic spheres, active in our cultural spheres, people who form the glue. And I've heard similar things from people who were leading figures in Egyptian society before the Jews were kind of driven out of Egypt to almost entirely there as well. And so, and you look at places across Central and Eastern Europe where in the aftermath of the Holocaust, Jews were decimated. So much was lost, not obviously just for the Jews who were killed and lost many family members and so on in those appalling atrocities, but actually those societies too were weakened in so many different ways. And
I'd like to toss out this statistic, Phil. Hungary, not the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but Hungary itself had the sixth highest per capita GNP in the year 1899. Budapest was the sixth wealthiest and largest city on earth. Well, it will not surprise you to know that in the mid-1980s, Budapest was not in the top 20 cities in size or global GDP, and Hungary is not in the top 20 of countries in terms of its wealth or scientific production. And that, to me, encapsulates the phenomenon that you're pointing out. But zooming out to anti-Semitism, there are going to always be tons of conspiracy theories. Given the position that you're in and the insights that you have, speaking to government, speaking to leading theorists, being out and about in British society, what would you say to the assertion that when people are willing to believe the idea that a Jewish community of 200,000 or so in Britain runs Britain, and Britain is controlled so as to give money and arms to the Israeli government. What does that say about the health of British society? And what does it say when, you can have certain memes in some African country about the role of Jews in their politics? My contention is that just as people are willing to believe that Bill Gates puts a microchip in the vaccine to monitor you, if more than 5% of respondents tell a survey that they do believe that theory, we're in trouble. In other words, the healthier world that we lived in, I believe, say, in the late 20th century, was not a world where these ideas were as attractive.
I think that some of the attraction of conspiracy theories is it takes a complicated, disordered world and it puts in the mind of the conspiracy theorist the sense, oh, it's all so simple. There's a simple cause to our problems, whether it's Jewish people or Muslims or migrants or transgender people, whoever happens to be the focus of their eye. And if we can only deal with that one issue, everything would be fine. And so it feels fleetingly empowering to those people who suddenly feel that they've got it. They've got a sense of where the disorder comes from and how they impose order. It is actually worse for those people because they're attacking a problem which isn't the cause of the things that are affecting them. And therefore, they don't get anywhere near that they want to get. And I think, for example, and if I may make criticism of some parts of the Palestine solidarity movement, many of whom have really good initiatives and they believe in a Palestinian state and they want to move forward to a world of kind of better rights and equality for Palestinians, is absolutely right. But there are so many in leadership positions who seem to project kind of anti-Semitism or extremist view as part of the movement. And in fact, this has not helped them get closer to the stated goal of achieving a Palestinian state or more equality. Is in fact, in many cases, driven people to conclude these are not sensible people who are looking to achieve a stabilized, sensible place. They're addled with conspiracy theories, and it's made them less likely and less able to get what they want to get than what they might have been able to get if they'd taken a kind of more rational approach. They'd fought against anti-Semitism and drawn a clear line. Palestinian human rights, yes. Anti-Semitism, no, and indeed sort of pushed back in a very clear way against the extremism of groups like Hamas. We haven't seen that to the extent that we would like to see. And I think rather than helping those groups get what they want to get, it's in fact gotten in the way of them achieving what they want to get.
I agree completely. And one way to point this out is when the Assad regime was dropping barrel bombs on its own citizenry, or as the Sudanese Rapid Reaction Force, as the genociders in Darfur are now known, is doing humanitarian crimes in their countries. What do you know? We don't really see so many protests in Westminster every Saturday. How do you explain that to parishioners in the Jewish community? And then how do you explain that to those people who do want a Palestinian state, but are not protesting about Syria and Sudan?
I think a part of it, a kernel of it is anti-Semitism, that there's this exceptional nature of this conflict because Jews are involved in it. I think there are some other features too. I think in a lot of cases where terrible things are happening, there is no media allowed anywhere near it, whereas Israel actually has a very significant amount of media freedom. I know journalists can't get into Gaza, which I think is a shame and is the wrong choice. But journalists are able to operate in Israel very freely. It's actually a reasonably good place to live. Whereas a lot of conflict zones, it's hard to be there. It's hard to operate there. I think that Israel, because of its centrality to not just Judaism, but Christianity and Islam, the names of the places and the nature of this kind of resonates in a way. People have a better understanding of where these places are than places in different conflict zones, which they may never have heard of or may have no connection to. So there are these features that make that conflict greater. But you can't explain, for example, why there were not anything like the same kinds of protests outside the Russian embassy following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine than there have been throughout this conflict. I don't think you've seen really anything of that scale outside Russia at all, Russian embassy at all. And I think it's telling, and I think a strong kernel of this is anti-Semitism and a unique burdening of Israel and the world's only Jewish state with a challenge of disorder that people seem to want to challenge.
Have we seen global politics in the democratic world fragment towards this issue? That we've bizarrely seen the right, say AfD, Svenska Demokraten, Reform, Trump, people who harbor white nationalists and sometimes anti-Semitic white power movements, bizarrely rally around Israel, like we're talking in the wake of the killing of Charlie Kirk, who bizarrely, many in the pro-Israel circles in the United States are saying he was a hero. Well, he was an anti-Semite who believed in replacement theory, but he happened to say worse things about Muslims. And so we see the right coalescing around Israel as like a totemic, look, white people are under threat and it's a race war. And then on the left, from elected politicians like the mayoral candidate for the Democrats, Zohran Mamdani, here in New York, to every kind of left-wing movement in Spain and Ireland and elsewhere, the call for cultural boycotts. Israel shouldn't be able to play in Eurovision. How has this issue fragmented politics globally in a way that even the Russia issue is not a wedge in the core of our body politic?
It's a very, very good question. I think that we have a situation from the Jewish community's perspective which is really terrible. We have extremists on all sides who are taking views, almost all of whom don't like us, whether the far right, the far left, Islamist extremist groups. We are in the focus of all of them. And, I regret that far right extremists have taken on the Israeli flag as a symbol. It's regrettable, just as I regret that there's a kind of extreme anti-Israel and often anti-Jewish reaction in parts of the far left and Islamist movements. So we're sort of caught in the crosshairs of all of that. I think for the far right, you have this unfortunate identification with Israel as a bulwark against Islam and the developing world, and therefore, even if they don't like Jews, they're happy with Jews to leave their countries and go to Israel. My grandmother used to be told, "Go back to Palestine," when she was growing up in the 50s in this country. The far right quite like the idea of a Jewish state where Jews can all go to, but certainly they seem to be excited by the idea there's this war against perceptibly what they think of as a common enemy, and that's really unfortunate because I think it brings together a few very negative things. But you can understand, and this again is very unfortunate, why some Jewish people and some in Israel say, look, we look around, we don't see many friends. Any friends here we'll take. And we were in this situation where last year the Israeli government invited us to a conference on combating anti-Semitism, and we had to decline because we realized they'd invited the far-right parties of Europe, the Rassemblement National and various other far-right parties. And we said, we can't be at a conference on anti-Semitism with far-right parties. That's kind of like inviting a fox into a hen house. This is really not the way to fight it. But it was really hard explaining to some of the Israelis why this was a problem. They said, well, these people are pro-Israel and therefore they're pro-Jewish. And we said, no, you don't understand. This is a huge mistake, actually. And so we're in this kind of situation of kind of being faced with all sorts of difficulties, sometimes friends we don't want, but certain people are saying, well, we need some friends. And that's the challenge of being in this kind of centrist, moderating position. You kind of got to try and see the world as it is, not entirely as you want it to be. And that's, that can be challenging.
For listeners who think Britain is really important, Britain must be probably the second or third most important international player in the Middle East. Could you give us an overview of the role of the UK government in the Gaza-Hamas war from 2023 to the present? What has Britain done, not done? How has the conflict in Gaza played out differently because of British actions? What has it mediated, conferences held about the hostages, about Palestinian statehood? Give us your overview of the last 2 years in this.
Certainly in the last few weeks, a lot of people in government have just reflected their sense, the UK government have reflected to me their sense of powerlessness over the situation in the Middle East, that notwithstanding the fact that they have significant military assets around and good relations with almost all the countries involved in it, they just feel unable to force through the changes they want to see, in a way that America could because of its greater levels of investment and all of the above, but also the Arab states that like Egypt and Qatar who've been involved in mediations, who have, say, more direct pressure levers on Hamas, for example. And the UK has been trying to play a constructive role. I think it's been trying. I don't think it's been doing very well. We'll get to that. But it also feels really despondent. And I think what it certainly does feel very acutely, and this is what we've been discussing a lot of this conversation, is the impact on community relations in the UK. And so they've kind of got this problem of a situation where they're getting getting it in the net from all sides, not really being able to be the agents of change that they'd like to be in the region, and sort of just feeling generally a bit stuck. And that being said, I think the UK could have played its hand a bit better in a number of ways. Early on in the Labour government, I was asked for some advice on the position. I said, look, this is a challenging situation. The first thing you have to say in order to be able to win over the Israelis is to show that you understand at a fundamental their security needs and concerns, which are legitimate. Hamas did attack on the 7th of October. Israel has been attacked on 7 fronts. If you explain that, or you show the Israelis that, you're then able to take on some of the more difficult questions about the end state in Gaza, how you come to an end of that conflict, how you deal with the situation in the West Bank and the settlements. But to be able to really get onto page one with the Israeli government, you need to show them and the Israeli people that you understand the genuine and legitimate security concerns that they have. That wasn't done to the extent it should have been done, I think, in the early days. I think there was this real sense that the Labour government needed to rebalance, as it saw it, the position. And it took a series of measures early on, which effectively alienated the Israeli government and made them see the UK as not an honest broker. At the same time, they were in a pretty difficult situation with many in the Palestinian side because, they were not seen to be able to affect the changes that they wanted to see there. For me, being able to engage and influence the Israeli government was for the UK good on both sides of it, really, because they could play the most helpful role. And what that's led to increasingly in recent months is, I think, policy initiatives and announcements that actually have been unhelpful, while Britain desperately tries to find a role for itself, which is mainly at this stage directed at domestic opinion. So, for example, the decision to recognize Palestinian statehood, I think, is a major mistake. And for the following reason,
And you've written an excellent piece in the Telegraph, which we will put in the show notes.
Thank you, Jason. Yes, so the challenge is this. I support a two-state solution, which means that at some point I would like to see a Palestinian state recognized. But that Palestinian state can't come in a way that rewards Hamas or makes Hamas feel rewarded for the actions of 7th October, or disincentivizes the Palestinian Authority from making the agreements it would need to make. The Palestinians have been offered in one way or another a state 5 times, and they've said no different times. And it has to, very importantly, and this is the most important thing at the moment, try and end the current fighting so that we can move towards negotiations of a lasting resolution. And unfortunately, the announcement coming as it did, which was a knee-jerk reaction because the very week before it, the UK government had said this isn't the right time, and suddenly it said, now we're going to do so, had all the wrong impacts that we wanted it to have. Because what it did is it emboldened Hamas. They didn't impose any conditions. They said there are conditions. If Israel meets these conditions, we won't do it. They had no conditions on Hamas, including, for example, releasing the hostages. So Hamas dug in their heels and they said this explicitly, this is a reward for the 7th of October. And the message to terrorist organizations around the world is a very bad one. Commit these atrocities, and under pressure, governments will give us what we want if we only fight this out long enough. The Israelis have responded by also digging in their heels and saying that they might take other kinds of actions, which rather than ending this conflict, take that further away. And at the time that the UK made that announcement, and indeed France and indeed Canada and Australia, there was actually some better optimism around the negotiations. There was a feeling that Hamas and Israel were nearly there. The Trump administration was kind of involved in these talks. And it seems that whatever's happened here, and Marco Rubio has explicitly blamed the French announcement, which was the first of these about this, Hamas dug in their heels and it's all kind of gone in exactly the wrong direction. I think that we are in this position. And what I've said to people in the UK government is look, it's not even going to help you on the domestic issue that you're trying to resolve. Because the reason that people are really angry and on the streets is not because of some theoretical declaration or not declaration. It's because real people are dying in a real war and there are real hostages in real tunnels. And whilst that situation remains, you're still going to have those levels of anger. So the focus must be on resolving that and on bringing a better resolution for Israelis and Palestinians rather than kind of gestures. We need substance, not gestures. That's what I argued in this piece. And so for me, that this is a mistake in the way that it's been done. Certainly without any condition on the hostages, Hamas has been able to claim it as a success. And I worry on all levels, the UK government will find itself in no better a place, and in fact probably will find itself in a worse place, because it's given away some of its leverage. It's seen itself, the Israelis see it as untrustworthy, the Palestinians see it as having given away leverage. We end up in a worse position.
Phil, you're preaching to the choir. Allow me to say that you have worded my talking points better than I could. I am very glad that it is you, not I, who have to make this case, and you've made it very coherently. We will also put links into the show notes to my agreeable disagreement with Jane Kinnenmont on the pod. I believe that unilateral declarations of the Palestinian state by European actors accomplish nothing. They are rewards for Hamas, and they bring Palestinian statehood further away rather than closer. So everything that Phil has said. Phil, rather than making policies about recognizing a Palestinian state or cultural boycotts on performative domestic optics, what can Britain be doing? Phil, will you order the disorder with me?
For sure I will, Jason.
So I see Britain has a major opportunity to mediate between the Spain, Ireland, and Norways on the one side in Europe and the Hungary, Germany, Poland's on the other. What would you suggest to the British government as a role that it can play constructively in ordering the disorder?
I think that the first thing it should do, as I say, is to recognize the shared threats that the UK and Israel face from, for example, Iran and its proxies. And I think that the deployment of the Navy in the Red Sea against the Houthis and kind of striking back and preventing Iran doing the things that it's done, and we know from the UK intelligence services that Iran poses a threat here. I think projection of that is very important, and would also do a lot to be able to win the argument with the Israelis about, we've got your back on security, now you need to take some pretty serious actions to resolve some of the internal challenges. You buy yourself some credit to do those things. The UK has this pivotal position in Europe and with America that would enable it to take a really strong leadership role in bringing together the global coalition to try and tackle some of the challenges. Unfortunately, and I think you've been really ahead of the curve in analysing this, the old alliances that meant that Western nations would come together are not always here. So that something that underlies this to an extent that it shouldn't is France-UK rivalry. You know, Macron trying to pose himself as this great statesman and coming forward with this, we'll recognise a Palestinian state, absent of really much idea of how that looks or what the positive impacts will be. But the idea that it's a big gesture and he likes a big gesture has thrown rather the UK into taking that leadership role in trying to respond to the blow of that and the impact of it on UK domestic relationships. I think the UK needs to have a clear eye on what the outcomes it wants. And they tell us repeatedly they agree with all our aims, get the hostages out, prevent Hamas being able to govern Gaza, get aid into Gaza, work towards lasting peace and security. Focus on those aims and project all the influence into trying to do those things rather than gestures. And if you do that and you show that leadership, in fact, I think people will come in behind because people are crying out for leadership. They want to see really strong efforts to resolve these problems rather than manage them. And by the way, I want to be critical a little bit of the Israeli government. I've said this about the situation there too. Part of what has led us to where we are is the Israeli government's position over now 15 or so years of conflict management rather than conflict resolution. And you see that when you don't resolve conflict, it builds up anger and despair that empowers terrorist organizations like Hamas. And what we really need to see from the Israelis and indeed the Palestinians and their friends of both of those societies around the world is coming away from the situation of conflict management and moving instead to conflict resolution. We do not want to see more of this situation, this ongoing conflict. Many of the Arab states, I think, don't want to see it too. They want to see a more ordered Middle East. That was part of what the Abraham Accords was about. I say to the Israelis, it's very important that you understand the context of the atrocities of 7th October. This is just to understand why then, is because they could see that Israel and Saudi Arabia were close to normalizing relationships. And for extremist groups like Hamas and their paymasters in Iran, that is a disaster. An integrated, ordered Middle East would have squeezed extremist groups, including Hamas, and marginalized Iran. And actually, all of those things are in Israel's interest.
Brilliantly put, Phil. It's really been an honor and a pleasure hosting you on the Disorder podcast. I hope we can make it a regular thing.
Thank you, Jason. It was a pleasure. And thanks for all the work you do to order the disorder.
Awesome. If you enjoyed this show as much as I enjoyed chatting with Phil, Please rate it 5-star on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It helps others discover us. Also, if you're concerned about these types of issues, share this podcast with your friends. Getting the word out is the best way to help order the disorder. For more on what the Board of Deputies does, as well as some of our other treatment of issues of conspiracy theories, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, solutions in Israel-Palestine, check out the Substack. The link to it is in the show notes. If you think that this show was too one-sided, or we really talked just a lot about Israel and Jews, well, guess what? We're going to be talking with a representative of the Palestinian community next week. Please join us to hear Sam Bahar, who will be in Ramallah when I speak to him. I can't wait. Until then, I'm wishing you an orderly week.